Hey, everyone should be flowing in now. Welcome, everyone. So a few others will be joining over the next couple of minutes, and I'll just keep admitting them as they come through. Hi, welcome. Okay, we might as well get started as we've got some housekeeping to get through as well while everyone continues to join. But welcome everyone to Impact Innovation and LSQ's online event today, focused on the ISO Innovation Management Standards. My name's Ali Connors from Impact Innovation, and I'll be your tech producer and co-host for today. And we've also got our Managing Director, Brian Ruddle, which will be hosting the event. So, Brian, if you could kindly please flick to the next slide, we'll just run through, run through some housekeeping. Thank you. Okay, so everyone's screen should look something similar to this. To view your view options, just click on the view options menu bar at the top of your screen. And next slide, thanks, Brian. And so that the workshop can flow smoothly. For now, all participants are muted, but if you'd like to ask a question at any time, please feel free to utilize the chat function. I'll be monitoring the chat throughout the event, so please feel welcome to enter any questions you have, and I'll ask on your behalf to Brian. And in addition, if you're having or experiencing any technical issues, let me know in this function as well. We'll also be recording the session for today, just because a few people weren't able to make it. So we'll be sending this out after the event. And just quickly, we also acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So with that being out of the way, I might hand over to you now, Brian, to kick off to today's workshop.
That's great. Thanks very much for that, Ali, and welcome everyone. We've actually got a good roll up today, where there's a lot of people that were registered. I think we had over 55 people that registered for today's event. Hence doing the recording, which will be around for everyone to have a look at later as well. So just really quickly, a little bit about Impact Innovation. I know a few people that are on the line today, but we've been going for a bit over 15 years. We've got 3 business units. So we do a lot of work on innovation management systems, and so working with larger organisations, corporates, not-for-profits, government, and also research organisations, putting in place internal innovation management systems. We also do a lot on commercialisation, working with startups, research commercialisation, and also working with SMEs on product development activities as well. And then we run a number of training courses, so about 60 to 65 events a year on innovation and commercialisation, with a big focus on practical application. So moving past a lot of the theory into how do you actually get value from this thing called innovation, or how do you get value from research commercialisation type activities. In terms of today's event, what we're going to do is to cover off on 4 main areas. We'll talk about the ISO Innovation Management Standards. I chair Australia's committee for this. So give a bit of background as to what's happening with Australia, Australian committee members, where they're coming from, but also the international context and how all of this came about, and countries that are involved and things like that. We'll then step through and have a bit of a deeper dive into the published standards, and just give you an overview, if you like, of what they are, but also their relevance, if you like, to different types of organisations. Then we'll get into a bit of a so what, why should I care? And this gets into, I suppose, some of the practical side of things. How organisations are using the standards, how they're getting value out of them, and how it's actually starting to change some of the dynamics in terms of how organisations are approaching innovation in a different way to drive more value. And then we'll sort of talk through some scenarios as well. Looking again at the concept of an innovation management system from the perspective of different types of organisations, depending on different, if you like, types of ideas or projects or activities that you're undertaking. As Ali mentioned, please interrupt or send through any questions, and Ali will interrupt me, and we'll treat this as more of a discussion. The purpose of this, when we first started having a discussion with LSQ, was to make sure that LSQ members were aware of the standards. And so if you do have any questions, just feed them in, because I'd prefer to go off topic and answer those questions rather than just sort of, blindly go forward and just run through the deck. So just sort of starting with the Australian and international context, a number of you will be aware of what standards are, but there's standards in a whole range of different areas, from anything like electrical standards that need to be complied with before you can introduce a new product that's got electrical wiring and the like, through to road signs. For example, there's standards on those in terms of size and location and a whole range of different bits and pieces. These ISO standards on innovation management, I suppose, started to come about because a number of countries actually did start to put in place standards around innovation management. So particularly the UK and also France, who have had standards on innovation management for nearly 20 years now. So a number of other countries started to do the same thing. And then there was a submission put forward to actually create ISO standards on innovation management. So Australia was a little bit late to the party. So a lot of work had been going on. Our committee was only formed in late 2019. But there's 47 participating member countries. So what we basically do from an Australian perspective is we sit on international working groups, and we work with innovation specialists, if you like, or practitioners from around the world, in terms of looking at how different countries are actually approaching innovation management and collating and collecting and bringing together a lot of essentially best practice approaches in terms of actually managing innovation programs. So we've got 5 standards that are developed. We've got 5 that are still under development, and I'll talk about all of those. And I suppose from the Australian committee perspective, as I said, I chair the committee, but other committee members come from a variety of research organisations, from government departments, but also from private sector organisations as well. So innovation managers from those organisations. And so what we do from a perspective of the Australian committee is that we focus on in getting engaged and involved with those working groups overseas, but we're looking at it through the lens or the eyes of the Australian ecosystem. Apologies if you guys are hearing any background noise. I don't know if you can, Ali, or not, but the neighbours decided to mow the lawn, and so apologies if you start to hear some noise in the background.
It's sounding okay to me for now, Brian.
Excellent. Just thought I'd check. So the countries that are involved, this is just to give a quick overview. Some countries are more involved than others, but ultimately when we start to get to a point where we're bringing standards documents together, all countries are reviewing and their committees are reviewing these standards, trying to improve them essentially, and kick them along. So just to sort of digress a little bit before I start talking about the standards, I thought it might be useful just to overview a little bit more about what we look at when we talk about an innovation management system. So, so this diagram, it's a stylized one that we've brought together out of the standards document, but it starts to highlight the key components of an innovation management system. So they include the leadership, the commitment, vision, strategy, and policy around leadership when it comes to innovation. We've got support, so the resources, the team's competencies to actually manage the innovation program and other support mechanisms as well. And that's within this context of plan, do, check, act. We're constantly updating things and feeds into the operations, or if you like, the funnel, around where the ideas or the initiatives or the research projects are coming into the pipeline, how we actually progress them all the way through to development and deployment out the other end. And that deployment can mean different things to different organizations. For research organizations, deployment could be a licensing deal, or activities or working with spin-outs or startups. For others, it's deployment internally within their organization as a new product or service or a process. So it all depends in terms of the context of the organization. And that's this other element here, looking at external and internal issues, culture, collaboration. I suppose one of the key things that we talk to a lot of organizations about when it comes to an innovation management system is that it needs to generate value to the organization. And again, that value can mean different things to different organizations, but it's really important that the outcome is value. The second thing is that the innovation management system, or the purpose of having an innovation management system, is to drive strategy implementation. And so every organization has a different strategy. And so the purpose of having this innovation management system is to actually fast track or drive the implementation of strategy. So this comes back again to the flexibility of these innovation management standards. Yes, there's a framework, but how organizations use them is very, very unique to that organization. So again, if an organization wants to be have world-leading products and services, their innovation program may be more aligned with engaging with research organizations, very patent-heavy type approach, with using international distributors, or they may have overseas organizations they're collaborating with. That may be how their innovation program is set up and how that drives value and delivers strategy. It could be that another organization is really just looking at efficiencies in their organization. So the innovation program might be very much more inward focused, looking at cost savings or other efficiency measures. And so their innovation program, the type of activities they have coming in or projects, what they define value as being, the support requirements, would all be geared around that particular element. So, so I suppose that's probably the important thing, because a lot of people, when they start looking at standards, they think that they're very set and rigid. These are guidance standards rather than conformance standards. So I talked about an example of road signs. So road signs, for example, is a conformance standard. Everyone has to comply with it. These are guidance standards. They're here to help guide and direct, rather than saying that there's only one way of doing things.
Brian, just building off looking at the structure and system of innovation, we've had a question come through around whether the standards really dives into, I guess, the organizational architecture of how innovation teams or structures are set up. So for instance, having a dedicated department for innovation versus more of a lean approach to facilitate innovation across different teams.
Yeah, it's a good question. It does dive into each of these areas. And so, and I'll talk about the different documents in a moment, but what they call 56002, which is where this diagram comes from, actually does do a deep dive into all of those different elements. The The challenge though, and we often get this question from our clients, is where should an innovation team be located? Now, should it be in a strategy division? Should it be within HR? Should it be in the IT group? And unfortunately, there's no one size fits all. And this again is reflected in the standards. It comes back to the organisation and what they're trying to achieve. If they've got a very heavy digital product focus type strategy, it may be that the innovation program needs to be located there, if that's a driver of the business. If it's very much internal process, well, then maybe HR could be the way, or a lot of sort of putting them more within strategy now, linking back to, driving strategy implementation. But it all depends on the organisation. But the standards do a deep dive and look at team structures. They don't always have to be full-time. Larger organisations have full-time, but SMEs may have part-time roles, and which again is fine. It's not about creating this huge infrastructure type thing. It's actually about having appropriate resources, appropriate structures, and appropriate activities based on what the organisation is trying to achieve. So there's a number of different standards documents, and again, the part of the I suppose this purpose of these sorts of presentations is to give you a feel for what they're about. So the ones at the top there in orange, they're all the ones that are published, and all of those are now Australian standards as well. There's no difference between the international standards and the Australian standards. They were a direct adoption. The ones down below are still in development, and I'll sort of step through those in a bit more detail now, because what we're going to be doing is spending a bit of time on the published ones, just to again fill you in and let you know what they're all about. But the ones that are still in development, 56001, there's work starting on more of an auditable process type document. Early days, it's going to take about 2 years before that starts to come through. That working group is just starting, and so at the moment I'm on that working group now as well. Intelligence management is nearly done. That's sort of looking at innovation from the perspective of collecting information to help support strategy development, which is quite interesting. Idea management is sort of looking a lot at how to actually manage ideas through a stage gate process, and that's coming along pretty well. Tools and methods for measurement, so they're your KPIs, if you like, or indicators around innovation programs. That's probably about another 4 or 5 months away. So I sit on that committee as well. I was involved in writing the portfolio measurement side of that particular standard, but that's currently going through international review at the moment. So I actually had a meeting this morning with my committee where we were starting to look through a lot of our comments on that particular document, just to make it a bit easier to read. And then the bottom one is just examples, and that's nearly finished as well. There's also an SME handbook that's under development. That was a joint activity between ISO and the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO. Not sure, it was supposed to be coming out earlier this year. I was on that one as well, and when I spoke to the leader late last year, he was hoping it was going to come out in March, but I haven't heard anything yet, so we'll have to wait and see. As I said, I'll spend some more time on these top ones though in a moment, and sort of step you through them. So just starting this conversation about how do these standards start to help. And this, I suppose, is a diagram that we've been sharing a lot with government departments at the federal, state, and also local level. What we've found over the last few years is that there's actually a lot of focus and a lot of activity happening on the supply side of innovation. So that's startup hubs, a lot of focus on research commercialization, pathways and things like that. There hasn't been a huge amount of focus on the demand side. And so that's established organisations, and how do the established organisations engage with research? How do they engage with startups and startup hubs? And linking a little bit even with, I know we've got a number of research organisations or people from research organisations on the line today. But what, I'm going to get a blowing action happening outside, that's great. But what we're finding is that while, say with CRCs, a lot of industry partners are involved, there's not many activities to help those industry partners. It's assumed that because they're companies, they know how to commercialise, they know about this stuff. But this is where the innovation management standards come into place. They're guidance standards. They're there to actually help established organisations with their innovation programs. How do they go about engaging and working, if you like, with the supply side? So this sort of building demand side capacity is sort of really looking then as innovation as a business process, looking at linkages to strategy and strategic intelligence management, that focus on decision making by management and how do they go about making decisions. Looking at return on investment when it comes to innovation, so picking up on that concept of value. Looking at risk management approaches, developing a culture, and there's often a big discussion, a big debate about the culture of innovation. I suppose, we do this a lot with our clients, but we tend to focus more on this culture of outcomes rather than just culture. And again, the standards pick up on a lot of this as well, that it's about the outcome from the engagement of staff and team members rather than just having them engaged. Building IP assets, and then sort of how to measure innovation impact. So the standards provide a guide for all types of organisations. It doesn't matter about the sector, the maturity of your innovation program or anything like that. All types of innovation. So it's product, service, business model, process. It doesn't, it covers all types of approaches. So, design-led thinking. We do a lot on systems thinking to get more outcomes when we're working with our clients, and that's part of all of this. It can be internal, it can be open innovation. Coming back to my earlier comment, it was actually about having an innovation system that fits the organisation, that drives strategy and value. And so the standards have been written in a way to accept that and to reflect that, because if an innovation system doesn't align really well with an organisation, it's what we sort of tend to call rogue innovation programs. They're sort of running off and doing something, but they're actually not adding value back to the organisation. And they'll generally get shut down after a couple of years because the board or the senior execs will say, well, why are we spending all this money? What's the value coming back to the organisation? So that's why, again, the standards are designed for that flexibility.
Brian, just before you move on, we've had a question around different models or tools to be able to evaluate an organisation's maturity.
Yep.
Any recommendations around that?
Yeah, so I suppose the thing that we do, and we've got our own tool for that, and it's not so much measuring overall maturity, but it's starting to identify gaps in the system. So coming back to that oval diagram that I had up previously, the big thing is sort of starting to identify what the resources are, or what you're doing in all of those different elements, and then starting to identify what's, depending on if it's early stage, what some of the key concerns and problems are, and how to actually improve the system at an early stage, mid-stage, and even late stage. And I'll sort of share a diagram a bit later on, but I'll cover it briefly now. But because it's a system, it's a little bit like our, our body, if you like. Our body might be working fine, but then if we binge on chocolate, for example, all of a sudden our body gets, out of whack. Because we've changed the, outside internal operating environment, and so it affects it. It's the same thing with an innovation management system, is that it might be working really well, and whether that's at an early or mid or a late stage, but then if you get changes occurring, all of a sudden the system will not deliver value. It could be changes in senior execs. It could be a change in strategy at the board level. It could be that key partners are requiring different things. There's changes to what customers need. All of these things start to impact, if you like, on the innovation program, and that's why it's more important to look at it rather. It's not so much benchmarking; it's more about identifying gaps in the system. And sort of, just picking up on what I said a moment ago, we've got a process called Innovation Navigator for that purpose, where we can come in and analyze a system and identify what key 2 or 3 or 4 things need to be focused on to improve the system to generate those better outcomes.
I just put the link in the chat as well, Brian.
Sorry, what was that?
I just put the link in the chat as well.
Great. Yeah, so have a look at that. Yep. So with the published standards, as I said, I'll just step through what these are about and just give some examples. It's one of the interesting things with Standards Australia. Their revenue model is based on selling standards. So there's all of a sudden a number of different standards that people can buy, funnily enough. So that's why we sort of step through and just explain what these are about. Some are going to be maybe useful to you, others maybe not so useful. And so starting with 5-6000, this one is really about definitions and basic principles around innovation. Where this standard is really useful is if you've got challenges with a larger team where different words or different concepts mean different things to people. I think we've got a few organisations here that have got either campuses or offices overseas. It's really good from that perspective to try to get those different team members on the same page by using definitions and terminology that are based on a standard. Where we've also found that it's been really good that is that you can for government departments in particular, what they can start to do is to get some clarity around that in their terms of the programs and when they're starting to engage with different stakeholders as well. We had some interesting feedback at the federal level when they were negotiating some of the free trade agreements, and being able to go through and actually look at the definitions and go through a process where, I hope those guys are nearly finished. My apologies, everyone. That they could go through those definitions and actually help to engage with overseas countries in terms of developing free trade agreements. So that's just a bit of an overview there. They're quieting down outside now. My apologies again. 56002. Now, this is probably the main document to look at. So this is the document that has that oval diagram that I was talking about. And so what this one does, it really steps through those different elements of an innovation management system and looks at things like the leadership, the planning. It really delves into the support requirements and what to consider when you're starting to look at support, the operational aspects of managing stage gate systems and the like, and touches on performance evaluation as well. We tend to find that a lot of people really like to sort of delve into this one and use this as the basis for the work that they're doing in terms of building out an innovation program. 56003 is about innovation partnerships. So in Australia, we tend to look at this as collaboration, if you like. What this standard does, it starts to look at it as a proactive activity for established organisations. So why do they want to form those partnerships? How do they evaluate different partners and trying to work out whether they will actually add value to their organisation? And as I said, it's more of a proactive approach rather than reactive. And when we sort of talk about collaboration in Australia, it's more of a reactive, let's try to work together. This is more of a proactive, how to actually go out there and find partners that will add value to your business. Innovation Management Assessment. This is essentially more for internal teams about how to do internal assessment activities, but sometimes bringing in external as well. This is a fairly stock standard. How do you assess a system? There's not a lot that's really new in this one, but it's sort of part of any management system needs to be assessed and improved. And then we come to IP management. So this is looking at IP management in the context of an innovation management system. So how does an established organisation get value out of IP? Not only patents, trademarks, know-how, the whole gambit in terms of IP, but starts looking at it more as assets within the organisation. And again, how do organisations get value out of those assets? And how does that align with strategy and all of those sorts of things? So that's the quick run through. And again, happy to take questions about those individual standards, and we can loop back to those if we need to. But I think it's useful to be a little bit skeptical at times. And like we get a lot of people when I'm presenting these standards saying, oh, how to, you've got standards, but then you need creativity and, you need, all of this flexibility and things like how, the two don't align. But coming back to the earlier point that what all the standards do is to set the framework. And it allows for a systems type approach to get value. It doesn't stop creativity. It doesn't stop creative activities occurring. But what it starts to do is get to, well, we've got to create a creative activity. We've got a heap of ideas. Well, what happens with those ideas? How do we evaluate them? How do we take them forward? Or even before we do that sort of activity, how do we start framing it so we get the right sort of ideas coming through? And it sort of starts to look again at how to drive it all the way through to, if you like, deployment or an outcome. Pardon me. So this was a really interesting diagram that the guys over in China, so they ran an event, when I say the guys, so that's their standards committee over there. And they ran an event, looking at the standards and integration into Chinese businesses. And they shared this slide. And I thought it was really interesting and starting to look at time down the bottom, but then, professionalization. And so, you've got project management as a profession. Then you've got quality management. Then sort of innovation management is sort of starting to be seen in the same way. And so where these standards are helping is to start looking at innovation as a business system, as a process. And it's like anything else within an organization. How do you get value out of it? How does it, add value? How does it drive outcomes for an organization? The other thing, when we start talking about innovation management systems and the so what, is using, I suppose, focusing on that term system. So, within an organization, they generally have HR systems, finance systems, they've got production systems, they've got research management systems. But this is the same sort of thing. You have an innovation management system to drive an outcome, have a commonality of language to make it easy for people to engage with it as well, because they understand how the system operates. Coming back to that earlier question about maturity, it also, by having these standards, what it starts to do is it helps organizations to actually look at it as a bit more of a system, but see what elements are missing or what elements need to be enhanced to improve an outcome. So when we've shared this diagram with organizations, a lot of them will say, actually, we've got those different elements, and that's fantastic. The thing is that I've never actually thought of those elements in this sort of way before. And then you start talking about, scaling the innovation program, or what additional elements or resources do you need to be bringing in? Is the stage gate system actually working? And we're doing a lot of work now with a number of research clients all the way through to corporates on the stage gate system. It was an interesting little comment, and I know we've got a number of researchers online today, but within a lot of research organizations, they actually don't have a funnel. They've got a sausage. The sort of research projects go in and they don't disappear. And so we're doing a lot of work with research organizations at the moment about how do they actually manage this in a bit of a different way within a systems context. But coming back to that operations, it is about that ROI. It's sort of the deployment at the other end and getting value at the other end. Not saying that every project has to be successful, but you need some to be. Otherwise, over time, you're not going to have a sustainable innovation system. So this is borrowed from our friends at Bright Idea, but they've just mapped out a simple process about solving a problem, announcing it, get solutions, evaluate, hand off the solutions. But the key thing is implementing it and getting those solutions. It could be a process, it could be a new product or whatever, but more a process thing. But how do you get that value? So I just remembered I did have the product or service one, but it's the same thing. You can take it through a process, but you need to launch. You need to get that value at the other end. Otherwise, you've spent a lot of time and effort on these early parts. And if we don't get deployment or launch or implementation, then it's not a very effective innovation program. Either the wrong ideas are coming in, the wrong validation activities are being undertaken, wrong stakeholders are being involved at the wrong times. And so, that's where it's not so much about maturity of the innovation system, it's often more about the focus and whether the system elements are actually working well together. The other thing, and coming back to the so what, is that it starts to look at the value of time, particularly in terms of projects and going through and how to actually start, focusing these things. And particularly we find with SMEs who may only have 1 or 2 projects going at any particular time. Often they don't have very robust Gantt charts, for example. They're not pushing project teams to achieve or to get to a particular TRL, technology readiness level sort of thing at a time or whatever. Time tends to just, projects tend to drag on rather than being shortened up to get impact and outcomes faster. And again, the standards help to start looking at that in the context of what value is to the organization and the impact of time or the value of time as part of all of that. And I mentioned earlier about the system could work, but then if you eat a heap of chocolate, your system won't work well as well. This is the reason why. So this is modified out of the business model canvas book. And if a lot of people talk about business model canvas, but not many people have read the book. If you're really interested in commercialization, driving outcomes, product development, really encourage you to get the book. The back of it is fantastic, but most people don't even know that there's more than just the canvas itself. So this is one of the diagrams out of the back of the book. In their diagram, they've got the business model and being impacted by key trends, market forces, macroeconomic forces, and industry forces, because you can set up a business model, but over time it'll have to change. The same thing with an innovation management system. You can set it up, but then you'll have all of these external forces that will start to impact on the efficiency and effectiveness of an innovation system. And so again, by thinking of it as a system, you're actually going to be able to modify it in response to that. And COVID, if you like, is the great example of that. Major pressure, a number of projects that might have been dropped off have all of a sudden been reintroduced in because the organisation has had to change the way that it operates. So just an example there. Feel free to send through any other questions as well. So otherwise I'll just keep rabbiting on.
We just had a comment, Brian, that the business environment canvas is similar to Porter's industry analysis model.
Yep, true. So coming back to some scenarios and some examples. So for a lot of organisations like SMEs, some larger corporates that may only have a couple of little R&D projects that they're claiming R&D tax on, or as part of their product development activities, it may be that they've got part-time roles in a few of these things, but they might have, say, 3 projects going, different stages of maturity. But even so, the leadership needs to understand what the overall strategy and vision is for these projects. There needs to be a stage gate system in place, really, to make sure that we get those projects to the other end and deployable, and sort of getting them out the other end there. But then support requirements, the resources, competencies, linking in with other organisations and bringing them into the operations at the right time, again, within the context of where the organisation's going. The reason for sharing this as a scenario is that we see with a lot of SMEs that they've often got a number of R&D projects, but they generally don't think of it as a system. And often there'll be R&D projects that are there because they're being claimed against R&D tax, but in a lot of ways they may have been better to be killed because they're not going to get to the other end. They're not going to get that value. And so by sort of organisations looking at the standards and starting to look at this as a system, they can start to evaluate where those projects are up to. Open innovation's a great term that keeps getting thrown around. We've often have organisations come along and they've run a bit of an open innovation activity and they've got 70 ideas and they don't know what to do with them. And that's again where the standards or the concept of an innovation management system helps, because before you do open innovation and get all of these ideas or concepts, you need to understand what the process is going to be to get them through and to validate them and hopefully deploy 1 or 2 of them, but then also the support that's going to be required, and then again linking back to the leadership in the context of the organisation. And when you start thinking of those things before doing an open innovation challenge, you'll actually generally go out with a different challenge statement, and the evaluation approaches that get put into place are very, very different because they're put in place within the context of what the organisation is trying to achieve. Collaborative research. So often we see, and like, so picture this oval is an industry partner. Often we see a project sitting within a research organisation more than sitting within the industry partner's innovation management system. So the industry partner might be paying for research, but the question is, do they actually understand what their process is to deploy the outcomes? Do they know what resources they need to be able to, pick up a research outcome and get it through to deployment? How does that align with strategy? And again, how does that align with the context of the organisation? It's been really interesting talking to a number of research organisations about essentially screening their industry partners. And we've got another tool that sort of looks at this as well, that, it's great when industry partners come along and fund research, but if they don't understand a lot of these different elements, will you finish the research and will it really struggle to get that uplift because it doesn't fit in within that, or that industry partner's internal processes? In their, they just don't have an innovation management system. So it's an interesting conversation to be having with industry partners. And then finally, licensing. So research organisations do have an innovation management system. Their operations and what's going through is essentially getting it to a point where a bit of technology might be ready for licensing. And so that would then come into a partner's or a licensee's innovation management system, because they pick up on that technology and they still have a lot of work they need to do to get it out to a product or a service or deployable. So it's interesting when starting to look at innovation management systems that everyone has essentially got one. And this is where collaboration starts to come into play, how to actually engage with other innovation management systems as well. So that was sort of getting to the end, and I know we've got a bit of time, and it's sort of really happy to have sort of any other conversations or discussions. But through, I suppose, feedback from a lot of clients and also people that we've been sort of sharing the innovation management standards to, we've built out a training course, which is sort of helping organisations actually look at how to use the docs and how to actually, set up or to enhance, if you like, an innovation management system. So, at the end of this event, we'll send around a bit of a link. It may be something that's of interest. But again, when we were talking about running this with LSQ, we thought it might be useful just to let people know that that's around. Because as hopefully you've sort of seen through this, the standards are quite interesting. They help to provide a bit of structure, but they're only ever interesting until you put them into practice. And so that's the purpose of this course, is to really help organisations take that next step and to put them into play. So that gets me to the end, here to help. As I said, we've got that training course, but if you do, as I said, very happy to take on any other questions that you might have now. I know we've covered a fair bit with all of this, and for a number of you, this is probably the first time that you've come across the innovation management standards and even finding out that they're around. But down the track, if you do have other questions, feel free to email us. I'm happy to provide additional information. We've got on the website, our website, we've got a listing of all the publicly available information as well on the standards. And so, Ali, you might want to grab that one and just throw that in chat as well. It's a bit of a problem in that it's pretty hard to find all the information. So we've just sort of dragged what we can together just to make it easier for people to have a look at it.
Okay, that link's in the chat now.
Okay, excellent.
So I don't think we have any other questions for the time being. Oh, actually, I spoke too soon. Brian, could you shed some light on the Innovation Management Assessment Standards, so 56004, specifically how university tech transfer officers can benefit from them.
Yeah, look, so those assessment standards are really just to assess a system. So it covers off on the identify how you want to evaluate your system, what your KPIs are, and things like that. So and then who you're reporting back to about whether the system is working or not. So that's the context of that particular standard. Where I think, and this comes back to, I'll just go back to that oval diagram. Where we start talking about tech transfer officers and others, where I see some value is starting to look at the pipelines in a bit of a different way. And then also looking at the resources that are being put in at various stages. Now, we've done a lot of work with tech transfer officers over the years, trying to improve those systems, but that was before these standards came out. I think having more robust stage gate approaches would help, and particularly being able to communicate those to research teams as well. So we did a piece of work for CSIRO where we actually built out their new commercialization framework. That was for the Ag and Food Group. So we've got a few others that are looking at that now. But what we found was by actually staging it out a little bit and being able to communicate that back to researchers, for the first time they understood where they stood, if you like, or where their research projects were mapped, if you like, against the stage gate process. And so we're sort of seeing that's really helping with a lot of engagement, because again, it's really hard if researchers don't understand the internal processes within a tech transfer office. They just get frustrated, when they're not getting responses and things like that. Whereas if there's a common framework, it's really easy to say, well, you haven't got to this stage, or you need to provide this bit of information, or we need to get to this TRL level, or we use commercial readiness. We've got a different model around that. How to get to that point. And then if you can communicate that back to the research team, they actually design their experiments to collect the data that you need to get to that next stage. And it just helps streamline a lot of those conversations.
Thanks, Brian. And Claire's just sent a lovely message saying that on behalf of LSQ, she'd like to thank us. So thank you, Claire, and thank you for helping to organise this event today as well, and to everyone that's joined online. As we said, we'll send out a copy of the recording and then also just follow-up information that we went through. If anyone has any further questions at all, though, please do not hesitate to reach out to our team. But aside from that, I think we can wrap up, Brian.
Okay, sounds good. Give everyone a few minutes back in the day.
That's it. Thank you again, everyone. Have a great day.